It is my privilege now to introduce Dr. James Taylor, who is the moderator for our event. Dr. Taylor continues a long tradition of Scudder service to medicine in India. He received his medical degree from the University of Virginia School of Medicine and served a neurosurgical residency at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine, and also completed a radiation therapy residency at Ohio State University. Dr. Taylor's great-great-grandfather, Dr. Silas Downer Scudder, founded the Scudder Memorial Hospital in Ranipet, India. Dr. Taylor is a member of the board of directors for the Vellore CMC Foundation.
Thank you, Deepika, and good morning or good evening, as the case may be. As Deepika points out, this is one of 10 events celebrating the 75th year anniversary of the foundation in its current format. Today's event will look into the origins of the foundation and of CMC by focusing on the Scudder family of medical missionaries. 203 years ago, John and Harriet Scudder set sail for India. Their missionary ideals find continued expression in the activities of the school, the hospital, and of the foundation. The Scudders of old are with us now. Our first speaker, Sue Swanson, trained as a historian. She worked professionally as a historian, and she has taught history. Sue has served in leadership positions at the Vellore CMC Foundation and the Scudder Association for many years. Sue is the great-granddaughter of Silas Scudder, founder of Scudder Memorial Hospital in Ranipet. She has studied it, she has lived it, it's in her blood. I look forward to the comments of Sue Swanson.
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted that you picked the title about the evolving role of Scudder female missionaries for this talk, because this is International Women's Month in March, so it's very appropriate. Between 1820 and 1970, 15 Scudder men gave 420 years of missionary service. In contrast, 26 women gave 580 years of their lives to the missionary work in India. This is a story of a select few of those women. What drove them to leave the warmth of their families and the familiarity of their homeland to follow their men on months-long dangerous sea journeys across the world to a land so different from their own? Who were they really? What were they like? I believe that the women, I'm going to fix this here. I believe that the women were a large part of the reason that the Scudder Christian Medical Mission was so successful that 200 years later, their hospitals and schools not only exist, but expand to serve the Indian public. But more than that, it was the dedication and loving spirit of these women that resonated with the Indian people they touched and healed. They lived by the Christian belief that it was more blessed to give than to receive. They lived fulfilled lives and spread their loving spirit and support to their husbands and children in this foreign land. It was this loving spirit that Aunt Ida gave through her healing touch to patients as they were rolled into surgery. It was this loving spirit that Aunt Ida passed on to her medical students that still lives today in the corridors of the Vellore Christian Hospital and Scudder Memorial Hospital. It was hard to choose which women to highlight today out of the 26 women who gave so many years of service in India, and I hope you enjoy the stories of these extraordinary missionary women. In the 19th century, the Christian faith governed most American lives. They began and ended each day with prayer, and their faith sustained them during times of grief and heartache that we can't even imagine today. The death of women in childbirth, the death of children and adults from accidents and diseases. Little was known about India in America at that time, and India was viewed as exotic and exciting. So to go to India to do Christ's work as a missionary wife was admired and very fulfilling. However, it meant leaving their families behind forever and was also dangerous as childbirth and diseases filled the Indian cemeteries with many missionary wives. Harriet Scudder, the wife of Pioneer John. Harriet Waterbury and her 25-year-old husband, Dr. John Scudder, headed to India with their 2-year-old daughter in 1819. Pioneer John, as he's known in the family, was the first medical missionary to go to foreign shores from the United States. It wasn't easy. John's father disowned him for becoming a missionary, and their daughter died of dysentery in Calcutta before they even reached Ceylon, today's Sri Lanka. 2 more babies died in quick succession within a week of their birth. It wasn't until her doctor husband allowed the Indian midwives to tend his wife that their babies survived. The Indian women knew how to care for newborns in the heat and humidity of India, and Harriet went on to have 11 more children. Harriet was often alone for weeks at the missionary station, left to care for over 40 people at the clinic while her husband traveled the countryside with his Christian message. Her brother, Jared Waterbury, after reading Harriet's diary of these early days, said, quote, "In Harriet's case, there was a more than usual draft on her strength as her husband had hospital duties at home and calls from every quarter to attend upon the sick. Yet she seems to have met all these responsibilities with a cheerful energy and scarcely ever complains of anything but occasional fatigue and exhaustion. The secret of all this lay in her patient spirit, her calm, collected energy, and most of all in her spirit of faith and prayer by which she drew strength from above," end quote. By 1837, Harriet and John had left Ceylon and were serving in India. John had become increasingly ill with malaria and was sent to the cool, healing climate of the Nilgiri Hills to recover. He was on his way home when he was seized with such a violent bout of malaria that word was sent to Harriet that he was dying. Although she was 8 months pregnant, Harriet left immediately with her toddler son, a tent, and bearers. Caught in the worst part of the jungle road at night, the bearers became terrified at the sound of tigers growling and fled, leaving Harriet alone to her fate. Clutching her little son, Harriet prayed all night on her knees with the sounds of wild elephants and tigers circling around her. But her prayers were answered. Morning came, the bearers returned, and she was able to reach her husband. He had survived, but spent long months recovering. Sending her children back to the US to relatives to be educated was very wrenching for Harriet because she knew she wouldn't see them again for years, if ever. It was one reason she kept on having more babies to replace the ones that left. Silas, my great-grandfather, and his younger brother John, Cynthia Cy Sherman's great-grandfather, and Reed's great-great-grandfather, were sent back to America at the ages of 7 and 9. Harriet was a strong support of John, helping him weather the rejection that he received as he attempted to convert Hindus to the Christian faith and standing at his side as he ministered medical aid to villagers. The wives of Pioneer John and Harriet's sons served long and difficult days caring for their many children and helping with the medical clinics and schools that their husbands founded. When the terrible famines hit the country, they helped distribute food to the starving, feeding the little children first and watching to make sure that the children didn't hide food in their clothing to smuggle out to their parents and older siblings. Dr. Silas was sent over by the Board for Foreign Missions in 1861 with his wife, Mariana. However, the American Civil War had just broken out as they arrived at Ranipet, and all funding suddenly came to a halt, not to resume for 5 years until 1866 after the war ended. Mariana and Silas stayed for 11 years while Silas was founding Scudder Hospital and providing the first medical training in India. Mariana had 5 children while at Ranipet, one of whom was my grandmother Helen, known as Ellen. Mariana was called Mame and is remembered as a very sweet person with a bubbling personality and full of fun and a great storyteller. She loved to tell the story of her first shower in India. Desperate to bathe after her long, hot trip, she was shown to the bathhouse. After completely disrobing, she was searching for a way to turn on the water when a soft voice spoke from above. Glancing up, she saw a young boy holding a jug of water perched on the wall of the bathhouse. "Please," he said softly, If the Darasani will just move a little closer to the center, I can pour the water on you. Welcome to India, she wrote her mother. Between 1861 and 1866, although he had no income, Dr. Silas did what he could to prepare to open the hospital. He learned the local language, studied Ayurvedic medicine, and tended to the sick as best he could. As for Mariana, the local British wives felt so sorry for her worn-out wardrobe that they passed their old dresses on to her. Although, Mariana said, they were all gray. I never knew what original color they'd been before the Indian sun bleached them out, but I appreciated them nevertheless, since my original dresses were reduced to rags. Raising babies at their little mission house was a challenge. One night, she got up to investigate her crying baby to find that white ants had crawled up the legs of the baby's crib and were feasting on the baby's scalp. After that, the legs of the crib were placed in cups of water to keep the ants at bay. Finally, in 1872, Silas's health, broken by amoebic dysentery, left India with his family. They settled in Brooklyn, where Mariana nursed Silas until he died at the age of 44 in 1877. Widowed at an early age, Mariana lived with Ellen after she married the Reverend Joseph Cochran. Their son, Hamilton, my father, was with Ellen, Mariana, and my grandfather at the founding luncheon of the Scudder Association in 1912, where the Scudder family pledged to raise the money to replace the derelict building that housed Scudder Hospital. It took 16 long years, but the building, nicknamed the Taj Mahal of South India for its beautiful white dome, was dedicated in 1928. Sophia Weld Scudder. Sophia married Dr. John Scudder, Silas's young brother, and came to serve at Scudder Hospital after Silas returned to the US. Like her sisters-in-law, Sophia produced a large family, 5 boys and 1 daughter, Ida, nicknamed Bonnie by the family because of her cornflower blue eyes. When told she had produced a daughter, Sophia said, "A girl? I can't believe it," and checked the baby to be sure. In addition to his medical work, John founded a number of Christian churches in the surrounding area and also started a boys' school that Sophia ran while he was gone. Sophia assisted John in his medical work, acting as a practical nurse. Known for her sweet nature and loving kindness toward the patients, Sophia was much beloved and a great asset to John. As their boys grew into teenagers, John and Sophia decided that they needed to earn more income in order to provide their children with an education. So they uprooted the family and moved to a farm in Nebraska. But John's heart wasn't in it, and his talent was not in farming. John and Sophia missed their medical and educational work terribly and returned to India after 5 years. Teenager Ida was sent to Northfield School for Girls in Massachusetts, founded by Dwight Moody for the Daughters of Missionaries, and was just about to graduate when her father, Dr. John, sent an urgent telegram telling her to come to India at once. Her mother was ill and needed her help. Ida took ship with her brother Walter, and while working at the missionary compound and school in Tintavanam, experienced the 3 knocks in the night that led her to return to the States to the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia. She and her roommate, Ellen Bartholomew, actually an unknown distant Scudder relative, bicycled over 200 miles to New York City for their senior year, entering the first class at Cornell Medical School to admit women. They graduated in 1899 and left for India, where Ellen, known as Nell, married Ida's brother Walter. Both Nell and Ida opened dispensaries and started providing medical care for women. Ida was depending on her father, Dr. John, to help her set up her practice, but sadly, he died just 5 months after her return. Sophia stepped in and became Ida's loving support and mainstay. In fact, at first, Indian patients pointedly preferred Sophia over Ida in providing a medical diagnosis. Sophia, whose medical knowledge was learned at her husband's side, treated over 5,000 patients herself. She also followed up on all of Ida's cases intelligently and performed the thousands of services which only a mother's love and pioneer missionary knowledge could supply. She also took over all household responsibilities to free Ida up for her medical work and entertained the many foreign visitors who came to Vellore over the years. Sophia was a lovely, warm, and talented woman whose traits were passed on to her famous daughter, Dr. Ida. Sophia gave the longest service of all the Scudder missionaries, 64 years. 6 others, including Dr. Ida, served more than 45 years in India. Third generation women. Dorothy Jellis Scudder, DV. DV Jellis was Boston's debutante of the year, but sacrificed it all to marry Walter and Nell's son John after whirlwind romance. When the young couple settled at Scudder Memorial Hospital, DV put her education and free time to good use by gathering together letters and documents left by Pioneer John and his 7 missionary sons, and writing the history of the Scudder missionaries of India, entitled 1,000 Years in Thy Sight. Several of the second generation and a number of the third generation missionaries were still in India and able to give her firsthand accounts, memories, and anecdotes of the early days of their missionary work. Her work saved vital records that would have been lost forever. After returning to New York, her husband, Dr. John, served as a surgeon and was instrumental in developing the ability to provide plasma to wounded Allied soldiers on the battlefields of World War II. DV served as secretary of the Scudder Association and on the CMC Vellore board for many years. She and Dr. John spearheaded the fundraising campaigns that helped build a chapel and the Dr. John Scudder Blood Bank at CMC. She was a dear friend and a companion on my first trip to India in 1978, and again when she dedicated the blood bank in memory of her husband, Dr. John, at CMC. Dr. Ida Bell Scudder. Dr. Ida B. and Ida's niece grew up on American Indian reservations, where her father served as a missionary. Her first introduction to her famous aunt was at a large family reunion in Nebraska. Summer heat had affected the food, and everybody came down with a bad case of food poisoning. Ida B. was only 7 at the time, but her memory of her Aunt Ida, bathed in the light of the kerosene lantern she carried as she walked from cot to give aid and sympathy to her relatives, never left her, and she determined to become a doctor like her aunt. Ida B.'s true love was pediatrics, but when Aunt Ida called her to India and told her that CMC needed a radiology department and she was going to head it, she answered the challenge. Years of training in the US and England followed before the department was finished, but Ida B. went on to serve for over 30 years at Vellore. She and Aunt Ida lived together along with their favorite dogs until Aunt Ida died. Ida B. was a wonderful, hardworking, and fun person. She retired to Connecticut to live with her sister, Lillian Fish, and I spent many happy hours driving her to New York City, the Scudder Association and Vellore Board meetings. I had the pleasure of accompanying her along with D.B. Scudder to India in 1978 to attend the Golden Jubilee of Scudder Memorial Hospital. What was it about those Scudders? There's something in my family that I call the missionary genes. They pop up frequently in the Scudder family and are recognized as the desire to help others, the willingness to work hard without complaint, the willingness to sacrifice for a cause, the willingness to work and volunteer for the good of others, often with little or no pay. They are also self-effacing and have a dauntless and energetic spirit. Nature or nurture? Probably both. But these personality traits spurred my ancestors and my cousins today to continue in their dedication to the Scudder-founded work in India. As a child, I spent many weeks visiting the descendants of John and Sophia at the Scudder Summer Compound on Shelter Island in Peconic Bay at the end of Long Island, New York. My dad built a summer home to be near them, and D.V. and Dr. John built a house on the bluff above the compound. My cousins, Cy, Sally, and Peter and I were all about the same age, and we spent wonderful days sailing, swimming, and playing tennis. What a fun and spirited bunch those Scudders were. No dour missionaries these. Aunt Ida was known for her pranks at school, and Nell shocked her husband Walter when she donned a ballerina's tutu and pirouetted around their bedroom. They were athletic, and the tennis court hummed with the sound of hit balls from sunup to sunset. The wraparound porch on the Big Victorian House provided a shaded grandstand for the admirers of the game and views of Peconic Bay. A big swing hung from the branch of an enormous tree off the side of the porch, which entertained children and adults alike. Besides the laughter, there was the music, especially singing. We sang songs and harmonized hymns on the beach around the fire, and Cy and I sang together as we did the dishes for the crowd. These Scudders were a spirited and gutsy bunch, and I'm happy to be one of them, and at my advanced age, still able to work through the Scudder Association Foundation to bring financial help to CMC, Scudder Memorial Hospital, and the schools started by the descendants of pioneer John and Harriet Scudder. Thank you for inviting me to share my memories of India and my Scudder missionary relatives. For more information on the Scudder missionaries and Aunt Ida, please visit the Scudder Association Foundation website. Click on News and Features and the online journal and read the Winter 2021 issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. I mean, it's a broad panorama over literally centuries. Thank you for giving us a deep feeling for the nature of the Scudder family and the Scudder missionaries. And thank you for all your personal hard work on behalf of CMC. Our next speaker, Rena George, is a CMC MBBS alumna from 1985. Her medical career included founding the palliative care services for CMC in the Ida B. Scudder Department of Radiation Oncology. She currently serves as professor in the Department of Continuing Medical Education for CMC, and she is also the CMC archivist. Rena authored a history of CMC entitled One Step at a Time, which was published in 2018. Her knowledge is wide and deep. Her insights are unique and insightful. I welcome the commentary of Rena George.
I'm overwhelmed, really. And thank you, Jim, Sue, John, and Deepika, for giving me this great honor to be a part of this with your family. It struck me that the name of my alma mater and our institution, Christian Medical College, captures the threefold impact of the Scudder missionaries. Dr. John Scudder and his sons came to preach the Christian gospel, but unlike many other preachers of the gospel, several of them were also trained to provide medical care. Their wives, of course, at that time could not be preachers or doctors, but it was they who started the secular teaching institutions, the boarding schools and day schools that transformed generations. Harriet Scudder, as we just heard, lost her first 3 children to death on the mission field, but she continued to serve in India until her own death. On the missions rolls, she was Mrs. John Scudder, an assistant missionary. She looked after the mission station, the boarding school, and cared for the children at home as John Scudder's single-hearted devotion to evangelism took him on long preaching tours. Often his wife did not know where her husband was or if and when he would return. When we look back 150 years later, it is probably fair to say that the greatest impact of that heroic missionary couple was through their children and grandchildren, rather than through John Scudder's own work in Sri Lanka, in Madurai and Madras. I think in God's economy, the little stones may be the cornerstones. For nearly half a century, the mission board was reluctant to send out unmarried women as missionaries. They came finally in the 1870s, and within a generation, unmarried women missionaries far outnumbered the missionary men, who were all sooner or later married. It strikes me that every woman director of CMC, from Dr. Ida Scudder in the last century to Dr. Joyce Ponaya in the present, has been unmarried, and vice versa. Turning to the second word in our institution's name, medical. The single women missionaries who came at that time could not be preachers and church leaders, and so their energies and talents went into starting hospitals, schools, medical schools, nursing schools, and more. And thus, compassionate grace and practical love became their primary witness to the gospel that Jesus embodied. There are so many unsung heroes among the medical workers. We heard a little about Dr. Silas Scudder, the founder of the Arcot Mission Hospital, who paid the price for his commitment and compassion with his own health and died at the age of 44. Then we have Dr. Ida's classmate and sister-in-law, Dr. Nell Scudder, who provided medical care in Dindivanam for 43 years until she retired, even as she brought up her family. And in a few minutes, we will meet her great-grandson, the Reverend Reed Sherman. I would like to conclude with a little about Rani Pitt Scudder, the Reverend Dr. Louis Rousseau Scudder. Dr. Louis Scudder, Dr. Ida's older cousin, the son of her uncle William, he was the one who, Dr. Louis Scudder was the one who reopened the Rani Pitt Hospital and kept it going. And we sometimes forget that Rani Pitt Hospital had started providing maternity care in that region, some distance from Vellore, even before Dr. Ida had become a medical student. And much later, when Dr. Ida, now senior and middle-aged, wanted to start her own medical school in Vellore, Louis Scudder supported her as council secretary. He did many, many things, from finding buildings to rent for the hostels, to getting the approval of the church mission boards, to sending financial reports. And Louis Scudder did all this even as he continued to work in his own short-staffed Rani Pitt Hospital, where the boys are not going to come to this girls' medical school, in its old borrowed tiled buildings. Dr. Louis Scudder looked beyond the needs of his own hospital and his own gender and his own denomination to the greater good. I have touched briefly upon education and medicine. Let me turn to the first word in our institution's name, Christian. The early missionaries held strict Calvinist beliefs. There could be no deviation from orthodox dogma. But the second generation began to see how interdenominational dogmatic differences were a barrier to the gospel in this new country. And in the early 1900s, the Arcot Mission chose not to become a part of a national Presbyterian church. Instead, they formed the South India United Church by uniting with the congregational churches in their region. It's interesting that the name South India United Church does not carry a denominational tag, only a geographical tag. The church is not labeling itself Presbyterian or Reformed or Congregational or Calvinist. And 2 decades later, when Indian clergymen of the South India United Church wanted to look beyond Calvinist traditions to form a new Indian church, uniting with the Anglicans, Louis Scudder, the son and grandson of passionate Calvinist clergymen, and the Arcot Mission itself gave their wholehearted support to this venture, because dogma and control, I think, were less important than fraternity and fruitfulness. But of course, it was not that simple at the global level. Although the Arcot Mission was all for it from the 1920s, but since the Protestant Reformation, denominations that had bishops had rarely, if ever, united with denominations that did not have an episcopal hierarchy. And there were long and knotty discussions that went on. Finally, it was in September 1947, shortly after India became independent, that the Church of South India was born, a union of Reformed, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, and Congregational churches. To conclude, as a testimony of the work of the Scudder missionaries, we have Christian Unity, the Church of South India, medical care, one of the world's largest Christian hospitals, and colleges and schools of medicine, nursing, theology, and more. I think all of this could happen, like Sue said, because each generation expanded the vision by looking beyond the barriers of gender, culture, or dogma. And I think they were able to look beyond those barriers because they were not seeking power, recognition, or worldly success, but working with love for God's work, a work much greater than any of our own little missions. I would like to end by saying that the legacy of the Scudder missionaries reminds me that in God's economy and in God's eternity, small partners may leave big legacies. Small voices may have big things to teach us, and big differences may be of little consequence. Thank you.